Hello, friends. It's time for another fun video with Nathan. And today, we're going to keep it very concise on a specific topic. That topic being the moral dilemma of the development of civilization and the maintenance of civilization. Okay. And I've heard an expression before you say something, think, is it kind? Is it true? And is it necessary? And I kind of like that because there's a lot of things that are true that, you really need to bring up something that's going to be upsetting or offensive to people. Like, sure, it might be true, but like, why are you talking about it? The fact that you're bringing it up in and of itself is it's a choice. So there's a lot of things, especially, I've taken an interest in biology and politics and all sorts of stuff for many years, but I don't choose to talk about them because a lot of it's unpleasant and no one likes it. And it's also often boring. And you don't want to just walk around making people uncomfortable all the time for no reason. And I just wanted to say that because you can be rest assured that if I am saying something like in this video or in subsequent videos, you can be reasonably certain that I am doing it on purpose, not just because I think it's true, but because I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary because the amount of confusion and chaos and like this lack of clarity of like what is going on in the world is so high that we've got to have some of these discussions. And I know that like there's going to be a lot of biology in here. There's going to be some things that are maybe offensive or even triggering to people because biology is gross and messy. But I do think it's necessary to talk about because some of these concepts are so helpful in understanding what is going on. I think it's worth the offense in some of these cases. So, with that little disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. I have a visual aid today. I'll be drawing along on this iPad here. So I want to talk about, first of all, the timeline of the development of life, right? And I'm adopting, roughly speaking, a common origin of life, evolutionary biology. But honestly, you don't even need to agree with common origin to agree with a lot of the concepts that I'm going to talk about here. The most fundamental thing is selective pressures. And even if you only believe in microevolution or something like that, selective pressures as a concept is so obvious to demonstrate and test and see in the real world today. I think we can all get on board with that, and I can move forward with my arguments here. But anyway, so let's get started with the beginning of life on Earth, okay? We've got little tiny bacteria here. The only thing that exists on the Earth are little bacteria, okay? And, they're basically like little thoughtless robots. Let's make different colors of bacteria. It'll be fun. We'll make some yellow ones that you can't see on the background. We'll make some blue ones. And these are basically little robots. Like, we don't attribute consciousness to little bacteria, single-celled organisms. But what they do is they just try to survive. They try to replicate. The most fundamental building block in evolutionary biology is a replicator, something that can replicate itself over time, okay? Selective pressures can operate over replicators. So let's say, they cluster together. They have little niches. They do their thing. They eat each other, reproduce. Okay, that's fun. And then you get, let's say, this is not at all going to be accurate. Let's say you get like little worms and stuff. You get little bugs. Let's make this bigger. You get little bugs in the environment. And slowly but surely, you start to build up an ecosystem, right? You start with very primitive, simple organisms, whether that's bacteria or even in the plant domain, like a pioneer species, like a certain kind of moss. It's very simple. And it's the first thing that can exist in a very barren landscape. And slowly you build levels of complexity up and create an ecosystem. So let's skip a little bit. You get some bugs. And another key thing here, if you are, let's say, a bacteria or a bug, and let's say you don't love the whole idea that you must kill everything around you in order to survive. Let's say you're a very kind, you're a nice bacteria, and you just want to coexist and share resources and be polite to everyone around you. If that's the kind of bacteria you happen to be, you will die almost immediately, right? Like this is self-exterminating behavior. That's a key term we're going to have in this whole video. It's self-exterminating behavior. And so the selective pressures at play will guarantee that all of the bacteria and bugs and worms and whatever else are going to act in their self-interest, and not just in the interest of their own organism. Like if the bugs had names, they're not just behaving in the interest of Jack or Joe. They're behaving in the interest of their genetic line because they're trying to propagate their genes, or really the gene is trying to propagate itself through the replication of organisms. It's kind of a different way of framing it. That's a Richard Dawkins thing, the selfish gene. So anyways, let's skip ahead to, let's make some bunnies. I'll try to make it as cute as possible because that is important. Oop, here's a bunny. Boop. Hello. You start to get little critters, you know? Little critters running around, and they still don't have like a strong sense of morality. It's not like they've created a civilization or anything like that. But you start to see some social behavior, or at least we can see social behavior. I'm sure it exists at a much lower level, but we can even observe the emotions that little animals have, the familial love they have for their children, or they will grieve if someone close to them dies. There's a lot more complex social feelings about what is good and what is bad that's starting to develop here. And eventually, I'm going to draw a bird just because I want to. Eventually, you get to people. That's not a very good bird. And I'm going to put the person right here. There we go. So eventually you get to people. And something happens, something magical happens, right? And I think that honestly, the best way to talk about this transition between kind of very simple organic life and human beings is the story of Genesis, actually. What's so interesting about that story is Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So like I said, the bacteria and the bugs, we think of them as robots. They act on instinct. We don't judge them like morally for killing and eating the things around them. We don't judge a lion for attacking a gazelle, even though it's hard to watch and there's a lot of suffering, and it's not cruelty because we don't apply the moral judgment, but it's pretty intense. And we don't judge those things because we think of them as amoral. They're acting on instinct. They're kind of mechanistic programs that are being played out. But at some point, whether you're religious or not, you appreciate how we made a transition from amoral mechanistic behavior and conscious moral behavior, where if you saw a person going out and like murdering a gazelle and ripping it apart in the same way that a lion does, you would judge the person morally and you say that's cruel, where you wouldn't say that about a lion. So, and essentially, my take on the story of Genesis is that it's an abstraction. There wasn't a point in time where this occurred, where there is a magic switch that is flipped. This caveman had no sense of morality and this human being has a sense of morality. Clearly, I think it grew over time to where we are today. But that transition occurred. There's a meaningful before and after, even though there wasn't a specific point in time that we can pinpoint. And when we do that, we are able to create civilization. Okay? Let's draw a circle right at the top. Civilize. And what is civilization? It is a bubble that we live in that is civil, right? So we don't judge outside of the bubble of civilization. There is nature, right, as we call it. And we don't judge the behaviors of those creatures. But inside the bubble of civilization, human beings, we do judge morally. We say that's good and that's bad, good and evil. So that's a key concept. Now, one basic observation here is this is a pyramid, right? Civilization grew out of and depends on the ecosystem that it came from, right? That it exists inside of. And it's not technically a contradiction, but it is something that we don't think about and is it's a little strange. So and I'm going to talk about two examples that illustrate this and the parallels even that exist between nature and our own existence that we don't appreciate. So some parallels between the wild natural world and the life that we are familiar with is when your body doesn't have a lot of calories, let's say you're going on a fast or maybe there's a famine, your body will flip into autophagy. I think I'm saying that right. And what that does is it looks around your body for damaged or old cells to clean up so that it saves resources. So it's not like feeding calories to the less productive cells. And long term, it makes you healthier. Like this is a process that everyone would agree is healthy. It's like if fasting prevents you from getting cancer long term, like thumbs up, that's a good thing. But if you take that same pattern and you scale it up such that it's in the bubble of civilization, what you see is essentially Nazi Germany, where the nation state, so we're not talking about a human being, we're talking about a nation state as kind of the organism we're looking at, was undergoing a period of stress and constrained resources. And so they decided to start killing disabled people, old people, and minorities that they thought at least were unproductive to their society. At least for me, I don't know if it is for you, it's really easy to see the parallel here. This is the exact same process, but it's unfolding at different levels of complexity, let's say, the different levels of the ecosystem. And as soon as some of those natural patterns start to appear inside this bubble of civilization, things get really weird and upsetting morally, right? It's a morally bad thing for us to act out. A second example is the concept of invasive species, right? Many people, like we talk about the spotted lanternfly. It's a bug. It came from another country. Doesn't like create food for things that live here. It just kind of destroys and kills stuff. It has no natural predators. And so everyone is on the same page. Kill spotted lanternflies. Feel no remorse, murder them all. And, it's a reasonable perspective because they will disrupt the ecosystem. But when you apply that same logic to, scale it up, nation state civilization level, that same pattern starts to look like xenophobia, where you have a country with a certain economy, right? Things work well with all of the people that maybe they even have their genetic heritage there, maybe they don't. But when immigrants come from another country, it starts to disrupt that economy, ecosystem, whatever you want to call it. It disrupts the system that was in place before and changes it rapidly. And, if you had that same attitude, you'd be calling for like the extermination of all immigrants, which is a very different vibe than like, let's kill spotted lanternflies. But it's really the same process, right? That's being acted out. And, something that was kind of spooky is I was walking in White Clay Creek recently, and there's a group of volunteers, bless their heart, who are going around like patch by patch doing an invasive species cleanup. And it took a long time, months. And by the end of it, like I would go walking through the forest, and if the sun was like low enough and cast the right light, it honestly there's these piles of dead plants like 10 to 15 feet apart from each other. And it just looks like a brutal genocide has occurred. Like you can just sort of imagine them being dead bodies and think like, oh my God, this is like a death camp for plants. It's a little strange. And I do find it strange that the parallel is hard for us to see But I think the pattern's really exactly the same. And the issue is the level of complexity at which it occurs and the fact that we need to preserve our civilization, 'cause to live inside of it. We don't want we don't want to commit genocides. We don't want massive amounts of murder and suffering inside our civilization, which I agree with. I'm not arguing that we should implement things just because we see them in nature. In fact, in philosophy, that is called the naturalistic fallacy, which is just because you observe something in nature means that it's right or good. And those are not the same thing as evidenced here. So another challenging thing, because there's just more uncomfortable things to talk about here. A lot of our deepest reward systems, it's another key term, have their roots inside of more primitive natural dynamics, let's say. So something that we, at least today, have a carve out. We have a little exception for romantic love. And it might sound weird for me to say that because we don't think of it as an exception to anything. But it really is. If you think about what romantic love is, it's human beings judging other people based on their genetics, something that they have no control over, and rejecting some people for having inferior genetics and treating other people very differently for having good genetics, rewarding that with, resources and protection and a relationship and all sorts of stuff. When you say it like that, it sounds evil. It sounds wrong. But, because our culture, we've kind of made an exception for it. We say, you know what, romantic love is good and special and we like it. And so we're going to turn a blind eye to the sort of genetic elitism that's going on, right? And what we get from that is, I'll just draw a little circle here. Whoop. What we get is it's supposed to be a heart. What we get is a deeply satisfying experience, right? Because it's a reward system that has existed since sexual reproduction was first innovated in life, right? So single-celled organisms don't do sexual reproduction. Cells just divide by themselves. But pretty soon in our whole evolutionary timeline, sexual reproduction began. And it's a common experience that we all share, like rabbits and birds and not puppies, but dogs and cats. Like they all share that universal experience of sexual attraction and romantic love. And the reason it's so deeply satisfying is because it has its roots in the very fundamental dynamic of life. It's existed for a super long time. And so it's encoded very deeply in us as well. A second reward system is preference for your own genes. And we also have a little bit of a cutout for this. Like we have an exception culturally to say that it's okay to treat your own children preferentially to other people's children. And this is not controversial. I buy a house, I make a nice house, I work, make money, and I provide for my own children. And I do not allow other people's children to live in my house. That's normal, not a big deal. But as soon as you expand that concept a little bit more in ways that does occur in nature all the time, to include your close relatives and people of your same ethnicity and genetic pool, we're not comfortable with that as a civilization. What does that look like? That looks like, oh, it's not just that I only let my own children stay in my house. I actually am going to start treating people of my own ethnicity a little bit better than people of a different ethnicity, right? There's a line that we have culturally to say, this is wrong. What color should we use for this? I'll use black. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay. And this also has very deep roots in our biology. There is a reward system that's deeply satisfying, kind of in the same way that romantic love and sexual attraction is satisfying, that rewards you for preferring people who have similar genes as you. And instead of us thinking that's cute and lovely, that is something a little different. This is not acceptable, right? And honestly, for me, it's a little bit of conjecture here because I grew up in the very individualistic Western liberal society. So I had no concept of affinity for your own ethnic group, like a shared cultural history, that sort of thing. This is very foreign to me. I was so individualistic. I didn't care about like my school flag or like, I truly thought like I am the only person that kind of matters to me more or less. And I kind of have this new perspective just from watching other ethnic groups and how they talk about it. Whether that's the Israel like kind of existing as an ethno state, which again gets a lot of criticism because it's an ethno state. But people who go there and they talk about how meaningful of an experience it is to have like that shared cultural history. And I think also there's this very frictionless emotional, psychological connection that you can just have with people who are like you, that you joke the same, you relate in the same ways, you have the same values and you care about the same stuff. Like it sounds a little silly to people in the West, but it's deeply satisfying. I think one example that we're all familiar with is like the concept of code switching, right? We've all probably heard Black people specifically talk about how code switching is sort of exhausting. How you have one way of talking at home or with your friends or with people who are like you, but then you go out into the world where you're a minority and you have to change the way you talk. And, it's more work. It's harder to connect and joke with people. And then when you go back home in your own community with people who are like you, it's like a breath of fresh air. And it's not like you're breathing through a straw anymore. You just get to let your hair down and relax and connect with people who are near you. So that's kind of why I'm pretty certain that that's a reward system that just exists in people is that rewards the preferential treatment of your own gene pool. So anyways, this is tough. We've identified a few problems here. And lastly, I guess the last problem I want to highlight is how moral offense is so context dependent. So I just talked about how our current civilization has an exception for romantic love, but not an exception for like racism, more or less, right? And that's true today, but if you go back to a different period of time, those things might be completely flipped just based on the context. So there's a lot of cultures that have arranged marriages, right? And if you were trying to like rebel against that norm and say, no, I actually just want to be with someone who I'm attracted to and I love, that would be more, not just upsetting or annoying, it would be morally repugnant to the people around you. And again, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine. But it's true. And even if you go back a couple hundred years, not even that. When women weren't allowed to vote, or there was just a culture of, women don't talk so much, right? The stories highlighting women as a main character, women speaking out in certain contexts, was seen as morally repugnant. And again, hard to imagine, I know, but I think it's an important thing to really grasp. So when you feel moral outrage, it's probably the same thing that people in these other contexts were feeling. And it's not always the same thing as the voice of God speaking to you. Like your moral outrage is a great tool and it's good and we should use it and rely on it for most situations in life, but it's not an absolute compass, and strange things can happen over long periods of time. And I think strange things are happening right now as kind of the post World War II consensus is fracturing and being renegotiated. I've talked about this before. The moral compass, the secular moral compass for the last 100 years or so has been Nazi bad. Like Hitler is the definition of evil, and individual liberalism is the definition of good. And you can sort of tell what belief is good or bad based on its proximity to either of those two ends of the spectrum. So if something feels like it's remotely close to Nazism or what Hitler would say, that's how you know it's bad, and you don't really need to think more about it. And if something feels sort of close to liberal individualism, you know it's good. Don't need to think about it. And boy, do we love not to think about things. So we've used that moral compass for a long time. And the problem is it is currently fracturing. And it's fracturing, I would say, for this one reason. I'll boil it down to a single reason. So if we go back to the concept of self-extinguishing behavior, we talked about bacteria, right? If you have a bacteria who's really nice and kind and just wants to play fair with everybody, it will die immediately. In the same way, the bubble of civilization that we've created, which rests on top of our genetic history, but is also like a special place inside of it, it's insulated. It can only exist if, as a whole, our behavior is not self extinguishing. And what I mean by that is if a nation state, let's just talk about nation state, is so nice to everyone, every other nation state around it, such that it, gives away its resources, is like, I just want to be nice and play fair for everybody. Eventually, they're going to be taken advantage of so much to the point that they collapse, and that country will no longer exist, and the world will be full of people, or not people, the world will be full of nation states that operate more along the lines of the might is right, I'm going to take what I can sort of mindset, kind of following these rules of nature much more than the rules of civilization. And ironically, nation states playing by those rules of might is right and I'm going to take what's mine is actually the thing that enables and protects the civilizations inside of the nation states, right? And this is a weird tension to come to terms with. Something that caught my attention was Stephen Miller talking about how he was appealing to this natural law. I can't remember the quote exactly, but he was saying like the U.S. is essentially justified in taking Venezuela because you can complain about what's good and fair and whatever, but like the natural law is ironclad. It undergirds everything, and that's what we're following. We can take it, and so we're going to. And the reality is, every country essentially operates this way, but they don't talk about it to its citizens because the citizens are living inside of the civilization. And the incongruity between the nation state behavior and the behavior of the human beings themselves is so different that people just can't deal with that disharmony. And so typically countries like the United States will go invade Iraq for oil, but they won't say that they're doing it for oil. And now it's like, you could say it's a mask off moment where they're just saying the quiet part out loud, but the behavior is really not any different. So anyways, just to wrap up, we got to wrap up. There are three main problems, and I'm not going to provide any solutions to them, but I just want to identify the problems and then leave. So one is we have to come to terms with our heritage. The fact that every human being alive today, every single one, even the most oppressed minority alive today, they exist because there are hundreds of millions of years of prior organisms killing, murdering, stealing, kind of doing unthinkable things in order to survive that laid the foundation for us and our civilization to exist. Like, we often get uncomfortable by maybe our nation's immediate history of the last few hundred years or even 1,000 years. We get very upset by that. Like, there are people living on the continent before Europeans came to America and founded the United States, right? That's very upsetting to people. We say, oh, well, this land doesn't belong to us. We need to do a land acknowledgement of some kind, which I get that they're wrestling with the uncomfortable problem there, but it's good to appreciate that like every single living organism for all the history of life has been fighting over every square inch of territory to the death, and no one is any different. And if you're alive, then you're the benefactor of that process. So we have to come to terms with the fact that we like our civilization, we like our morality, we like our sensibilities, we want to preserve that. But all of those things that we enjoy rest on a foundation of incredible suffering and barbarism. That is one main tension that we all have to come to terms with. Number two, our most satisfying reward systems are fundamentally rooted in primitive biological dynamics, and we are in constant tension between authenticity and the maintenance of civilization. So truly, like in every chapter of civilization's history, you will find stories about the suppression of natural urges and desires for the sake of stability, maybe the family's honor, civilization, something. There's always a trade off that occurs of sacrificing your own authentic biological expression for the preservation of civil society. And three, the third problem, if you don't embrace behavior to prevent your own extinction, you will die. And our moral sensibilities can only exist so long as our civilization is maintained. And yet, it depends on nature, or it depends on aspects of nature that we find repugnant. And I've said it already, so I don't need to repeat it too many more times. But I have no solution for this. In some sense, it's an irreconcilable tension, but also, you could just look at it as a big picture. This is the nature of human civilization, is that we can have moral sensibilities as human beings as we relate to each other, but at other levels of complexity, those moral intuitions, moral sensibilities don't work because they're self extinguishing. And I think that's helpful for understanding a lot of people's political opinions, especially now and especially in the next few years. You're going to see people that you know and love saying things that you think are morally repugnant and straight up evil. You're going to see it. And hopefully, all this context helps to make sense of what's going on there. Even stuff like hatred and bigotry, it's deeply seductive and satisfying because I don't know if I want to say we're designed that way, but selective pressures over the entire course of our development have made sure that bigotry and racism is a meaningful reward system in our biology. So there's a very thin path to walk between all of these tensions that we have to try to do. We have to try to maintain civilization and make sure we have enough resources and all that to keep our bubble intact, right? We don't want the bubble of civilization to burst such that all of the Western liberal relationships that we currently enjoy disappear. And we can't just blindly embrace patterns that we see in nature because a lot of them are cruel and unpalatable, to say the least. I offer no solutions. I'm going to wrap up here. Feel free to ask any questions, and we're going to tackle maybe some even more spicy topics after this, and we'll do our best, but any feedback is appreciated. See you guys later.